another video for you. This one a lot of you probably have also already seen. And then we'll get this panel underway. So without further ado, I give you the legendary drum. If you haven't seen this video by now, you already have.
It's a chocobo.
Okay, so, who needs microphones? I got a lot of those. This is Chocobos Ate My Baby. This is my gift to a game series that has been keeping me entertained since I was 8 years old. It was Christmas Day, some point in like the early 90s, and I am opening up this thing, and I opened up this game called Final Fantasy for my Nintendo. I'm like, what the hell is this? This is not the game I wanted. I pop it into my machine, and I'm playing the game a bit, and I'm like, wow, this game is kind of cool, but I can never do any damage. I have all these weapons. I forgot to equip them. I didn't learn that I have to equip the weapons until 10 years later. So that goes to show you how big of a derp I was when I was a little kid. But ever since then, I can honestly say I've played every game in the series. Yeah, I've played every game in the series. I haven't beaten every game in the series, but I've played every game in the series. So I am a level 99 Red Mage, and I am a Devil's Advocate, because this panel is not a Final Fantasy Square Enix hate fest. There are certain games in this series that I hate, as I'm sure there's certain games in this series that you all hate. How many of you hate at least one game in the series? How many of you hate more than one game? There we go. So I'm trying to be as objective as possible. There's only one game in this series that I'm just going to lambast and completely destroy. But I'm giving the panel I can do that. So this is not XIII Enix Hate Fest, but what I want to do with here is I want to talk about how the games have evolved as a method of storytelling. I want to give a retrospective of how the games have changed over the years, and like highlight what they did right, what they did wrong, and just their general impact. So before we start, we got to talk a little bit about Square Enix. Now Square, I'm not going to say Square Enix, we're talking Square Soft at this point, started off as a splinter group within Denusha Games that was well known for making crappy clones. The most well-known game they made was Rad Racer, which wasn't a very good game to begin with. The clone was even worse. And they were known for like just ripping off people's coding, palette swapping, copying mechanics, and they made almost no money, and they were going to shut down because they had like no one liked them. And then they decided they were looking at this game Dragon Warrior, that had just recently come out in Japan. And this was like the most popular game in Japan. You would see kids spending their entire weekends grinding just to play Dragon Warrior. And they decided to take a look at this and say, you know what? We can do this. We can copy this game. But you know what? For once, we're going to try and make a game that's better than the original. So they took all the coding, they looked at the characters, they looked at what they liked, they looked at what they didn't like, and they created Final Fantasy. Who here had the privilege of playing this game in the early 90s? So, one thing that people remember mostly about Final Fantasy, this sold 2 million copies combined when it came out. And it's been re-released, I think, 6 or 7 times for like the Game Boy Advance, for like the PSP. They had Final Fantasy Origins on the PlayStation. You can find hacks online to change the dialogue to make it into a porn game. Some people use the coding to create, some crafty people in China use the coding to create a Final Fantasy VII 8-bit RPG, which is also playable online, also with a patch that turns it into a porn game. And this game was designed to be the JRPG for people who didn't like JRPGs. Now, what does this mean? Well, JRPGs are known for 2 things, being hard and being tedious. Anyone who has ever played a Shin Megami Tensei game knows exactly what I'm talking about. You will spend hours and hours and hours and hours grinding your character up to the point where he can beat the one boss, then you repeat the process for the next boss. Then next thing you know, you've got 75 hours, most of it grinding, just so you can get a kiss from the princess and call it the end of the day. But by damn, you beat that boss and you beat him good. But what they wanted to do with Final Fantasy was, hey, let's take this JRPG and make it bigger. So they gave it a bigger world. They gave it more characters. Instead of one character that's consistently facing up, they gave you 4 characters that can move in all directions. They streamlined it, so you don't need to grind constantly. In fact, my argument in this game, you only have to grind twice. Once in the ogre field to get money to buy your magic, and again in the final dungeon because Chaos is a bitch on wheels. And they customized it, so you're not just a warrior with a magic with a stone and a few bits of smash. No, now you could be a red mage, you can be a black mage, you can be a white mage, you can be a warrior. You eventually, if you played your cards right, you could have a ninja in your party. My personal favorite party in this was the one you started the game with: fighter, thief, black belt, red mage. Honest to God, I had an easier time beating the game with that party than any other party, because magic meant nothing in this game. In the original Nintendo version, your knight on the final boss is doing hundreds of points of damage. Your black mage fires out a spell that does like 90 points of damage. This is like the most powerful magic class in the game, can't do anything to the bosses. They gave you the first interaction of a super hard, super rare boss in the Gundam, I mean the War Mech, that stood on a bridge with 64,000 HP, and if you could beat him, you got some money. And some money, and that's about it. At this point, you didn't even need the damn money. This game allowed you to interact with your environment. Instead of walking around and saying, what's here, what's here, what's here, now you actually could talk to people. People had voices. Your characters didn't, but the world did. Or you could just stand in place and keep clicking on the well and keep washing your face. You could walk, oh, there's a point in this game where you go to a graveyard and it says, here lies Link. There it is. It's in the Elf Kingdom. You go check every grave. One of them says, here lies Link. You could interact with the world. And that's what made this game so popular, is you weren't restricted. You had a lot of freedom. You had a lot of enemies. Most of them were palette swaps. But you had enemies. You had a big, deep story that gave you a boat, a canoe, and an airship. And you could fly all over the place doing really whatever you wanted. Now, one thing that made this game a lot of fun, at least back in my day, was this thing called the Nintendo Power Challenge. I don't know how many people remember this, but the job of the Nintendo Power Challenge is to beat the game with 4 white mages. Not white wizards, white mages. Don't do the class change and go right up to the final boss and try and beat him. I'm going to tell you, you have to be at level 99, and even then you'd probably die a whole lot of times before the random number generator worked in your favor. Today, that is not a viable challenge because the game is not hard anymore. All the re-releases scaled down the damage. But if you can track down the original ROM, I highly recommend taking the Nintendo Power Challenge. It will prove to everyone around you that you have no life. So, the next thing they did was Final Fantasy II. So, you've just done a massively revolutionary, groundbreaking RPG. So, what do to make a successful sequel? You tell Sakaguchi to get out of the room, and you hire this guy named Akitoshi Kawazu to do your game design. Now, this name might not be familiar to you, but I'll tell you some of the games he's done. Saga Frontier, Unlimited Saga, most of Final Fantasy XII, This is a guy who flat out said, I know I don't make good games. I don't care. So what you got was a game that, again, radical departure from the previous game. There are no more levels. In this game, you gain stat bonuses by using a stat. You gain HP by attacking yourself. You gain MP by casting spells. You gain new spells by casting old spells, and this was a game that had a very quirky game mechanic that was very easy to abuse if you're willing to spend 6 hours in the beginning game going into fights and just beating yourself up. Next thing you know, you're super powered and the rest of the game is a joke. Oh wait, no it's not. The difficulty level on this game was through the roof because of the fact that you couldn't grind for levels. Yes, it had 4 concrete characters with concrete names that could interact with each other over the course of the game. Yes, this game had a rotating 4th character. Every time the rotating 4th character came into play, guess what you're doing? Grinding to level him up. Because he always came in at the lowest possible level. But you started seeing things like a developed story. You started seeing things like Sid shows up in this game for the first time. Chocobos. In a very limited, there's 1 Chocobo forest in the entire game, but it's in there. Leviathan, what is known as the Great Water Dragon, shows up in this game for the first time. It was beginning to show the aesthetic elements of the future games in the series. Unfortunately, it's best known for being completely unplayable. Let me explain. Aside from the constant leveling of the main character, of the 4th party character, you had extremely limited inventory space. We're talking like 30 slots in your inventory. Each potion took up 1 slot. Key items took up 1 slot, and guess what? You can't get rid of them. There's a point in here where you have to spend a lot of time going on a wild goose chase. So you're sitting in the main town. So you've got to go to this castle somewhere. So you get in the main town, you walk to the port city, you take a shuttle to the other port city to get on the airship to go up here to get an airship to go back there. Okay, this guy tells you to complete the quest, you got to go back to the main town. So you go back up to here, take the airship down across the port to there. Okay, cool, now where do I have to go? Oh, we have to go to the south to find another item. So let's go back to the port city, take the airship across the water, go down to the south, backtrack, boom, then go back up to the top. Sup, Oliver. You go all the way back up to the top, and half of the game is spent in transit. If you had a Metro card, you'd run out of money very quickly. Another thing about here is there are doors that lead to nowhere. Now bear this in mind, that may not seem like a problem, but the difficulty level has been ratcheted up tremendously. The inventory space is severely limited, so you don't have a lot of healing items. Now, you open a door into a room, and you will appear in the middle of the room. Congratulations, there's nothing in the room. You try to walk out, every 2 steps is another random encounter, depleting your already dwindling resources. You would do this in dungeons for hours on end, dying repeatedly because of one other major problem. You see, running is based on your agility stat. The only way to up your agility stat is to dodge. The only way to dodge is to not get hit. But you can't dodge if you have a low agility stat, which you can't raise because you keep getting hit. So now you're getting into a fight every 2 to 3 steps with powerful enemies, limited inventory space, and you can't run from battle. This is why this game goes down as being unplayable. About midway through the game, most people say, screw this, throw the controller down and move on to the next game in the series. Because fortunately, the next game in the series fixed a lot of problems with the game. Okay, I played this game last year for the first time on a 12-hour train ride from Newport News to New York. I was down at Neck, well, you know, it wasn't 12 hours, it was more like 17 because Amtrak decided to break. But I'm riding back from Anime Mid-Atlantic, and I want to play a new game. I've had this game for several years, and I was originally put off by it because of the job class system. Here was a guy saying, I don't like variety. I want my 4 characters to go through the entire game. I'm the kind of guy who plays Chrono Cross with the 3 characters you get at the start of the game. And I go through the entire game with Surge, Glenn, and Kid. That's it. But I decided to give this game a chance. And one thing that this thing was noted for is, they said, okay, Kawazu, get in the corner, you're a dumbass. Where's Sakaguchi? We want him back. So they bring back Hironobu Sakaguchi, and with that you get experience, levels, classes, MP charges, and all sorts of stuff. But you see, Sakaguchi was a smart guy. He said, let's give you know how the last game had like 8 or 10 classes? Let's give them like 20, that you can change in the middle of the game. You just go to your menu, you click change job, and you change your job. Here we have the same idea of world building, creating a fully functioning, fully interactive, fully concrete world that is even bigger. Because now you've got the main world, you've got the shadow world, you've got the world above, the world below. Whoever was spending their time on Campaign Cartographer, I think he was just excited that he had a new world building program and decided to go crazy with it. This game also introduces the summons. So now you have classes that can summon monsters. Admittedly, like the Black Mage in the first game, the summoner isn't that crucial. I beat this game using a warrior, a dragoon, a ninja, and a devout. That's all you really need. Physical damage, as you level up, you start attacking like 700 times in one round, doing like 8,000 points of damage at once, breaking damage limits left and right. There's a coding glitch on the DS version, I don't know if it's in the original Nintendo version, where you says you're doing 9999, but you're really doing like 20,000 points of damage, and you'll see enemies die like this, and you're like, but I thought I had like 30,000 HP. Yeah, no, you broke the damage limit and they didn't tell you. This game gives you variety, variety, variety. It doesn't have as interesting a story as the previous game. You're fighting up against the Mouth of the Void, you're fighting up against the evil Emperor Zand. The story is somewhat lacking, but it makes up for it in what you can do. There are side quests, there are all sorts of... For the completist, you can spend the entire time just leveling your classes. Just so you can say, I have every class at maximum, great, now the final boss you hit in like 3 shots and he's dead. This is the first game with the appearance of the Moogle. The iconic little bat-winged whatever the hell they are that will eventually start delivering, the Moogle, that will start delivering mail for you. Then you become his postman and start delivering mail for him. Honestly, this game is known as being the hardest of all the Final Fantasy games for several reasons. Number one, when you choose the run command, okay, now you can run, but your physical defense drops to 0 and everything's attacking you from behind. I have played the game where I have used the run command and died trying to run. It is long and challenging because there are no save points in the dungeons. You have to save outside the dungeon. So the final tower basically runs like this. You stop outside the second to last dungeon, park your ship, save your game. You go into the second to last dungeon, fight your way through a super hard dungeon to get to the tower. You go up, fighting up a super hard tower, you make it to the first of the 4 optional bosses, and you die. You restart outside the dungeon, fight your way back to the super hard dungeon up to the tower. You get up to there, you fight the first boss, you beat him, you die on the second. You go back to the front of the dungeon. You go back through, you beat bosses 1, 2, 3, die on 4. Okay. You go back into the dungeon. 1, 2, 3, 4. You make it to the final boss, you die. Okay, now I've currently spent 2 hours playing this final dungeon. You go back into the dungeon, you go 1, 2, you die on 3. Because you're pissed off. This game is known for having a super hard final dungeon that will easily take up 6 to 7 hours of your life. Because if you die, you are completely screwed. This game also has points where you're required to use the mini spell. Little mini dungeons that you have to be tiny to get into. One of the first bosses you face is a rat. You are in mini form. You can do no physical damage to said rat. If you don't have a magic using job class, you're going to die a painful death on this rat that you normally would just step on. Later in the game, you meet a boss known as Garuda, who is shape-shifted. Garuda will wipe your party out in 3 hits, unless you have nothing but dragoons in it. This game had had a ton of bosses, a lot of them required little quirks to beat. If you missed out on the quirk, you died a horrible, painful death. I must keep mentioning emphasizing one main point. This game has no save points, period. That is the most important thing to remember. So you need to know how to manage your inventory and fight like the Dickens if you want to survive. This game was extremely popular in Japan. I do not know why it was not released in this country until 2005, but it was extremely popular in Japan, but we didn't see Final Fantasy again until this one came out. Who here remembers playing this game on the Super Nintendo? Who here remembers seeing Final Fantasy II and years later finding out that it was actually Final Fantasy IV? Here we have Sakaguchi and company saying, we're going to make a game for our new system. We're going to make a game that looks 8-bit, but plays 16-bit. We're going to look at a game that now, haste actually means something. In previous incarnations of Final Fantasy, the haste spell meant one thing. You got to attack more times. So your black belt, instead of doing 12 attacks around, is now doing 15 or 27 or 999. You're just attacking a lot. In this game, haste means you move faster. It means now you can attack 3 times in the span of time it takes one enemy to attack once. This game has, again, like the original, more of everything. More Chocobos, more items, more spells, more bosses, more dungeons, more worlds, more everything. And you start seeing the first inklings of your more expanded story and your more expanded characters. Now the mythology starts getting thrown into the game. Now you're starting to see more monsters being pulled from world mythology. You're starting to see dragon gods, and you're starting to see legendary demons. This is the first game to have the big boss plot twist. Right before you climb on the whale and fly across the surface of the moon, you find out, spoiler alert, that the big bad is your father, your brother. Over the course of this game, you are fighting this guy Golbez, who is this badass in armor. Then you find out, I'm being manipulated by this thing on the moon. How do we get to the moon? Whale. I'm going to say this. By the end of the game, the story starts getting a little ridiculous. I don't know how a whale manages to fly to the moon and then fly on the moon. It's damn cool, but I don't know how they managed to pull that off. This game also is a radical departure, and you have 5 party members. Not 4, 5. Now you can actually have 2 magic users, 3 physical badasses, and the game becomes a cakewalk at certain points. The problem with Final Fantasy IV, flat out, is, and I feel really bad saying this, because this is like, one of my friends loves this game to death, but this game is dated. Extremely dated. Fancy DS remake, fancy PSP remake, playing this game, you know you're looking at a game that was released in the 90s. The sprites look funny when they walk. Their attacks are pretty much run forward, throw your hands up, run back. That doesn't really look like an attack, I'll give you that. The music, the remixes, the Celtic Moon remix is better than the game's soundtrack. This is a game that is a classic in every step of the way, and a game that every Final Fantasy fan must play, but at the same time, it might be a little hard if you come from the PlayStation generation. Now, this particular game is not dated in any single way. Final Fantasy V, who here has played Final Fantasy V? Okay, for those of you that haven't, you can probably track it down for the Game Boy Advance. The Game Boy Advance will go down in history as having the best translation of this game ever. There's snarky jokes, risque snarky jokes. The main character's name, unfortunately, is not Butts, like it is in most of the games, but you can name him Butts if you want to. Final Fantasy V, otherwise known as Final Fantasy III too, because they're pretty much the same game. The same plot, the same final boss, the same everything. But here we're going back to the JRPG. So you have the advanced storytelling in Final Fantasy IV. Final Fantasy V decides to make it more human. Now you don't have a worldwide conflict that the characters are interacting with. You're dealing with a dude surrounded by 3 chicks. Seriously. Dude surrounded by 3 women. One of them is a magical lolicon. One of them is a cross player. And the third one is your typical Final Fantasy girl. This game, like the previous incarnations, wants more of everything. It has like, what does it say here? It has like less characters. You only get 5 characters throughout the entire game, but you have like 100 bosses. Every single one of them is a ball buster. Every single one of these bosses requires you to do something special to beat. There's one that is only vulnerable to fire. There's one where you have to dance. There's one boss, I think, in the game where 3 of your characters have to be consistently knocked out, or he becomes super powerful. This is a game that doesn't take itself too seriously story-wise, but takes itself very seriously mechanics-wise. Here you find, for the first time, the permanent, he's never coming back death of a party member. We're not talking about the party member retired. We're not talking about the party member turning stone and you restore him later. No. One of your main party members dies. Flat out dies. Tear-jerking scene as his granddaughter weeps over his dead body. But he's gone. Now, that is a damn tragedy, especially when you see how he goes out. But the game makes up for it by giving you super bosses. There are 2 bosses in this game that if you touch them, congratulations, you're dead. There's nothing you can do to stop them. You're dead. You need to grind for hours, and even then you probably won't win. This game also gave the first multi-form, multi-targeted end boss. The final boss is a pain in the ass, because much like Yuzuru Sephiroth, if you don't beat all his parts at the same time, they regenerate. And he is hard as hell. On the plus side, Gilgamesh. This is one of the first appearances of Gilgamesh. Now, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Gilgamesh, he's a mythological character. 33% human, 66% god, 100% badass. In this game, he is a laughing stock. He's an awesome laughing stock, but he is a laughing stock nonetheless. Gilgamesh and his pal Enkidu are working. What?
With awesome music.
Awesome. Yes, Gilgamesh, awesome music, awesome design, awesome everything, but he trips over his own 2 feet one too many times. This game marked a turning point in the Final Fantasy series. Up until this point, you're dealing with a developed in-game mythology. The original games all had this one thing in common, where you had these crystals that were the source of power on the world. The crystals were protected by these dragon gods, these primordial gods that eventually became summons. There was always talking about a balance between good and evil, light and dark, the void versus the eternal spring of life. These things were very much a part of the original games. They would borrow from external mythology while tweaking the source material a little bit. The idea that the ideal society mirrors man living in harmony with nature. Anyone who's studied Japanese culture knows that one of the main tenets of Japanese sacred practice is man existing in harmony with nature. They are very adamant about keeping nature happy. In these games, the states that live most harmonious with nature are the ones that get along and do well. Once you upset the balance, you become this gigantic, multi-armed evil god beast that needs to be put down by 4 orphans. It's usually 4 orphans. The main character is almost always an orphan, even if he's adopted by somebody else, he's almost exclusively an orphan. The girls are incapable of doing anything except casting spells. The guys are incapable of doing anything except going, Hulk smash, pound with a giant oversized sword. There's a lot of, the scientific term for that is dimorphism. Man, big, strong. Women, timid, meek. Man, punch in face. Woman, lightning bolt out the ass. And all the games up until this point, that is how their narrative is constructed. The least becomes the most insignificant among the person becomes the savior of the world and occasionally the king. Occasionally marries the princess. Occasionally becomes the princess. Occasionally becomes a girl. Occasionally becomes a guy. And the main thing to remember about Final Fantasy V up until this point, this is the last game Sakaguchi worked on directly. After this, Square is starting to become very popular. There's a lot of other games coming out in the Square arsenal. And while Final Fantasy continues on, Sakaguchi goes on to work on other games like Chrono Trigger.
Yeah.
He goes to work on Bahamut Lagoon, Secret of Mana, but Final Fantasy plods on with this. I love this game. In terms of narrative, this is the... You can stand up, Kefka.
Yeah!
In terms of narrative...
Oh, come here.
No.
You came off. Come here.
Yeah, I know, it's fine. It's fine.
Don't mess with Kefka. He can blow up the world.
This is sickening. You sound like the chapters of the self-help booklet.
And mastered nihilism in only a year.
So, this game, in terms of narrative, best in the series. Now you're having a dark world. Up until this point, it's talking about light and dark. It's talking about the triumph of good over evil. Not in this game. In this game, the bad guys win. In this game, you're dealing with the world on the grip of being destroyed. You try to stop the destruction and fail. And you deal with the world that, for the first time, you're showing a character as existing in a state of despair. Not everyone is like, oh great, I'm going to go out into the world and I'm going to beat up the shadow boss and I'm going to be everybody's super happy fun time. No, that does not happen here. You see a guy confront the spirits of his dead wife and child and get depressed. You watch as a clown blows up the planet. Another one that I like. You discover that the little orphan girl, her dad is the big bad ninja, but he won't tell her. You're dealing with a quasi-steampunk world that is slimy, sludgy, with a gigantic, overarching evil empire, full of technological destruction. Okay, I just finished watching Vision of Escaflowne. I cannot resist comparing this game to Vision of Escaflowne. You have the Zybok Empire in this game blowing things up because it can. I don't care for your allies. I'm blowing your stuff up. You're going into ruined castles. You get to see things get blown up and walk through the castle. This has a gigantic cast. So big that you actually can fit every party member into the 3 alt parties at the end and still have party members left over. You can play through this game 6 or 7 times and never use the same permutation of party members. This game has the best villain of any Final Fantasy, hands down. There is no denying how awesome Kefka is, because he wins. He's crazy. He betrays the big bad, becomes the big bad, pushes the statues out of order. You know why this game's really awesome? Because you win because you're better than him at the end of the game. He doesn't make a mistake. He makes no flaws. He is a perfect villain. You're just better than he is. This is the only game in Final Fantasy where you can honestly say that is the point. There's a lot of in-character relationships going on in this game. All of those in-character relationships are extremely well thought out. All of those in-character relationships are extremely fleshed to the point where you believe that the characters like each other. There's a lot of interactivity going on. Precursor to the cutscene, there are points where you walk into a room and the music changes and you realize maybe I should do something in here. When Cyan is grieving over the loss of his wife and child, you can't do anything. Well, I mean, you can run around on the platform and laugh. That just proves you're a dick. You watch how the story proceeds, and then it ends. And there's still things you can say like, where can this go? What happens next? This is the one Final Fantasy there's one other Final Fantasy I played where I said, what happens next? But in this game I said, what happens next? Because I was so attached to the characters, and I was so attached to the world, that I actually went and read fan fiction. Because I wanted to see what happens next. I cared about the game. Now, the next game in the series is probably, I'm going to say, one of the most popular. This game marked a turning point like every other game did because it was COMG polygons! Pre-rendered background, but your character is not a super deformed two-dimensional sprite that goes... Now your character could do this. Or this. Or this. Or my personal favorite. Your character can do stuff on screen. You're actually doing things. This game mixed Jewish and Norse mythology together. The world, I mean, it's obvious by the name Midgar. It's a world in the middle of the city where everything sucks. Anyone who's ever studied Norse mythology knows that Midgar is the middle world surrounded by a giant snake where everything sucks. The gods don't care. The gods have their own problems, mostly with the giant snake or that little laughing trickster dude in the shadows. You have to find a way to survive in this harsh, unforgiving world. That's Norse mythology in a nutshell. But you know what? Out of nowhere, here comes a guy pulled right out of Jewish mythology. Sephiroth is, as his namesake, he is trying to become God. He's trying to cheat at it, though. Rather than gaining legitimate enlightenment, he's just going to blow up the planet, absorb everybody's memories. I'm God now. Yeah, you're God of nothing, but you're God nonetheless. The game, you now lose those 4 characters, and you're now down to the Chrono Trigger standard of 3. So you need to have better strategy. Materia allows you to have better strategy. This game, like the previous game, had a lot of customization. This game has even more customization. If you want to turn Cloud into a magical girl, you can. You want to turn Aeris into a badass fighter? It's possible. I don't recommend it, but it's possible. If you can pick from your characters, like my favorite party to use in this game, ironically, is Cloud, Cid, and Red 13. Because Red 13 and Cloud have similar stat makeups, and Cid curses like a truck driver. So you know you're going to have fun playing him. Here we had another game, with the first game with a non-human main character. Red 13, I'm sorry, is a dog or a lion. But Red 13 is not a human character. It also is the only game in the series where you have not one but 2 characters cursing a storm. Profanity, where have you been? You're also starting to see a very popular theme of ideology creeping into the games. One could argue that in Final Fantasy VI, the ideology was racism. Mankind using the Espers for their own game, treating them like second-class citizens. Here, you're a bunch of eco-terrorists, blowing up a corporation for destroying the world. You're a bad guy doing bad things for the sake of the planet. The good guys are doing bad things for the sake of their pocket, there's a lot of questioning going on in this game. Now, one thing about this game, especially in recent years, it's become very divisive. This is why I say it's divisive. Final Fantasy VII is dated, it's old. I play it now, it doesn't quite have the same effect it had when I first played it, because, you know, I can just pop in like Skyrim, see a hot elf killing a dragon, and here I'm looking at a 3D character going, but I argue, and this is just my own personal opinion, the game is overrated because of the compendium. Who here played Air Guys? Air Guys was known as the Squaresoft fighting game released in the late 90s where you could play as Sephiroth, Yuffie, Vincent, Cloud, Tifa, and Red 13. If you wanted to have Yuffie and Tifa play volleyball, you could. There was a mode for that. If you want to see people run an obstacle course in a pro wrestling ring, there was a mode for that. That was the original fan service. Before Crysis was 2 Underground. Who actually played it?
Was it a cell phone game?
Yeah, it was a cell phone game. So underground. The fact that you played it, I applaud you. I can find you. Dirge of Cerberus was Vincent fan service. Take from that what you will. If you like Vincent, then it was a magnificent game. If you didn't like Vincent, it was Devil May Cry and Luca. Crisis Core was Yaoi fan service. I'm sorry, I waited how long for this game, and all I get is sexual undertones between Genesis, Angeal, and Sephiroth. Oh, by the way, I hate your battle system. By the way, I really hate your leveling system. By the way, I got rid of the game 4 days after I bought it because I couldn't deal with it. Advent Children, beautiful movie. 2 years of development. Okay, Advent Children is like Chinese democracy. After the amount of time they put into that, I was expecting something better, not Axl Rose doing what Axl Rose does best, pretending to sing. Kingdom Hearts, and I'm going to leave that to my good friend Oliver to deal with at some point. Kingdom Hearts, I'm just going to say one thing about Kingdom Hearts, because I really liked Kingdom Hearts when it came out. Then I went to a con and I saw a guy dressed as Sephiroth. I decided to talk to him. He'd never played Final Fantasy VII. He just happened to like Sephiroth from Kingdom Hearts. Then he found a Cloud and started making out. I have the video. Okay. This is why Final Fantasy VII gets a bad rap. There is really nothing, aside from the fact that it's old and dated, there's nothing really wrong with the game. I cannot find any issues with it. It was a lot of fun. Even today, you can still get something out of the story. There's stuff for completists. There's magical pots that ask for elixirs, and if you use the correct W item trick, you get unlimited elixirs. It's a fun game. Now for something completely different. Who here would love to play a game where Shinra fights Umbrella? You've got multinational corporation, zombies, Nemesis versus Vincent, they're basically the same character. Future tech, hot females fighting for justice, crappy movies attached to the brim. I've sort of liked Advent Children, I love Resident Evil Apocalypse, the rest of those movies can die in a fire. No disrespect to Mila Jovovich, but no. I've had enough of you.
I'd do her.
I would too. Okay, Final Fantasy VIII. Now remember back in the beginning I said there's going to be one game in the series I'm going to lambast? This is the single most divisive title in the entire Final Fantasy series for several reasons. I hate it for the following reasons. I hate the draw system. I hate how you need to spend 7 hours of your life before you go into the first dungeon drawing and refining magic. I hate that they didn't tell me in the rulebook you have to draw GFs off the bosses. I hated the draw system so much, the first time I played this game, I had 4 Guardian Forces. I beat the game with 4 Guardian Forces because I didn't like drawing magic. All I did was summon. And I didn't know how to supercharge at the time, so all I did was summon regular Guardian Forces, and I beat the game using that.
Bravo.
Here they have another example in Let's Tell a Really Interesting Story. They've broken into a dual narrative in the past and in the present, a little bit of the future. They got rid of money grinding because if you were a really good field agent, they paid you. If you had access to the internet, you cheated yourself up to rank S and never had to worry about money ever again. You had no armor in this game. Armor was determined by your guardian forces. Weapons, you went to the junk shop and fixed them. It is possible to beat the game using starting weapons. Again, I didn't know what the hell I was doing the first time I played this game. Goodbye super deformed models. Now you had characters that could actually move. You had your party member following you around. It only took 1,000 experience points to level up. In Galbadia Garden, fighting the hockey team, 800 experience points per battle. I leveled up to 99 with that. No effort whatsoever. In my humble opinion, it had the best soundtrack of any Final Fantasy game to date. I still listen to this game's soundtrack. I will forgive Eyes on Me. I liked that song when I was like 20. Now that I'm 30, I don't want to listen to it anymore. The problem is, well, this is the laundry list. Squall. I hate him. He reminds me of every emo kid I went to school with. I have a big sword. I need to remember how to feel. Now let me go get a hot dog. This game, I hate saying this, there's too much emphasis on a story that I don't give a damn about. Everyone has the same backstory. Everyone has amnesia. So they forget they all have the same backstory. You don't need to fight because the enemy's leveled with you. You theoretically never need to gain a level in this game and you can still beat the final boss. Squall, this is a quote from a review, an unlikable, angst-ridden jerk-off. Now, that said, once you get to the midway points of the game and you're not drawing one spell every time you use the draw command, it actually gets kind of fun. Now you can do your optional dungeons. I will admit going up into space was kind of cool. I admit fighting Malboros made me want to rip my already short hair out. The Malboros are the reason I have short hair, by the way. I had long hair in high school. Then I started tearing it out because of the bad breath attacks. But over the course of this game, there are a lot of people that love it. Because a lot of people, this was their first exposure to Final Fantasy. My argument is, if you took the words Final Fantasy off of this game, it would probably be pretty good. Comparing it to what came before, it's not. But on its own merits, it is an interesting, quirky JRPG that, again, is worth playing. It took me 3 playthroughs before I figured out that Laguna and Squall are father and son. But whatever, I've played the game like 7 times. It's the least of any Final Fantasy I own. But then they went and they did this. I found a Final Fantasy IX cosplay shoot last night and I had fun. Okay. This is my favorite game in the series.
Oh, yeah.
Hands down. No question, favorite game in the series. For several reasons. This game, if you don't understand nihilism and you don't understand existentialism, you play this game, you will figure it out. Why will you figure it out? Well, there's a scene in the Black Mage Village where you have to explain what death is. To someone who is essentially the equivalent of a 5-year-old. Ever try explaining to a 5-year-old what death means? You will start crying when you're done. You feel bad for these characters. Deeply philosophical game. My favorite moment in the entire game is when you are staring at death in the face. You're looking at him, and he says, all beings are born to die. That is your goal. That is like your destiny. Why fight it? And you give the greatest response, because we have to. That one sentence validates my existence right there. Because this is a game that talks very much like the early games in the series. Life and death, light and dark, existence versus void. And as you play through the game, you start to realize that, yeah, stuff sucks. Life sucks. But does that give you a right to give up on it? No. Zidane doesn't. He's emo for about 10 minutes over the course of this game, and it's warranted. Then he beats up a giant walrus and everyone's happy.
Giant walrus.
Giant walrus and all his friends to make him stop me. Where was this with Squall? Seriously, all the girls love you. You are the commander of Seed. You are bishy and attractive. Why are you so emo? Zidane is the same kind of person. But I digress. The one problem with this game was it was never meant to be a canon fantasy. This game and Final Fantasies X and XI were developed at the same time. This was originally supposed to be a gated side story. But they decided they needed a Final Fantasy game out, so they released it. No real marketing, no real game reviews, no push to the hardcore crowd. This is the closest thing Final Fantasy has to a sleeper title. Because a lot of people did not play it. A lot of people say it sucks despite the fact that they've never played it. A lot of people unfairly compare it to Final Fantasy VIII, or 10.
Or 7.
Or 7. Compared to, okay, I like this more than 7. I'm going to say, I like this, in my chronology, 9, 6, 5, 7 is in my chronology. This game deserved better. It was retro, not dated, retro. They were going for the SNESN. They were going for a lot of color. The return of the world map, the open-ended planet that you could navigate and go wherever you want. Chocobo, hot and cold. Yeah. Plunge your beak into the ground and find treasure. It was a fun game that had a lot of quirky mechanics, and one of my other favorite things about it was the active time event. Now the narrative allows you to see what your other party is doing. So instead of going through the game in 2 parties and wondering, I wonder what Dagger's doing right now. Oh, active time event. She's taking a shower. There's not, oh yes, humor. Like maybe 2 hours into the game, they're climbing up onto an airship. Zidane reaches up, grabs Dagger's butt and goes, ooh, soft. Humor returns. Dark as hell. Problem. Kuja. Can you say non-threatening? Kuja and the Thong of Doom. Completely non-threatening. I do not find Kuja, okay, so now Kuja's angry. He's flying through the sky in transform, and all I keep saying is, why do you still have a thong? And he's pink. I'm sorry, only one villain is allowed to get away with being pink and scary. His name is Galactus. Because he will eat your planet. Zidane will blow up your planet, but not eat it. Another thing I like about this is the way that they poke fun at previous installments. One of the first active time events, you have the band on the ship playing the Shinra March. And it's a really good version of the Shinra March. I wish it was on the soundtrack, but it's not. I actually had to watch the game, hook the TV up to my computer, and just rip the sound. Way too much trouble for a song I already own 3 copies of. Another thing I liked about this game, people would spend hours and hours and hours watching the ending to catch the references to Final Fantasy VII and VIII during I Want to Be Your Canary. No cloud, no squall shall stand in my way. No, they won't, Zidane, because you have a 10. And then we got this one. Final Fantasy X. What can I say about Final Fantasy X? Personally, I don't dislike it. A lot of people hate this game. Admittedly, much like Final Fantasy VII was aesthetically pleasing and beautiful, and a completely new game that showed the full push of what the hardware could do, so could this. Things, you have the spirit grid now. No more levels. No more running around grinding levels. Now you can run around grinding spheres, and you would use your sphere levels to up your characters. Oh, look, you can jump to somebody else's grid. So if you want your main character to know everything, Tidus can know everything, despite the fact that he knows absolutely nothing. Tidus is annoying, but not as annoying as some other main characters. That doesn't change the fact that he's annoying, but I'll get to that in a second. You have in this game, the boss of the game is Sin. And I love Sin for his simplicity. See, Sin is the first boss in a long time that is the bad guy just because he's bigger than the rest of you. He's the bully boss. I am big and whale-like. Hungry. That's what I like about it. There's no overworld map, but you can run around in the overworld as much as you want. There's just no map for it. This game, they called it, this was Square's attempt to make a true cinematic RPG, and they did. Criticized for not having enough, not giving the players enough time to interact with the world. This was criticized for not giving the players enough of a say. I mean, you could go to the movie theater and watch the battles you just did, but you really didn't have a voice. The voices were pre-rendered, the encounters were pre-rendered, and you had to proceed along a certain path until the end of the game. Much like previous games, it also had a lot of philosophy in it. This is probably more death-centric than Final Fantasy IX, and Final Fantasy IX is all about death. Another example of a ruined world where a monster is destroying things. I felt emotion when Yuna started performing the sending, because that was a truly tragic, tragic moment. it did have a really good cinematic storyline. Unfortunately, Square overreached a little bit. They tried to create a truly cinematic RPG and sort of made a movie. But honestly, if you want a cinematic RPG, there are better choices on the market. Especially today. Now, the one thing people remember about Final Fantasy X that people really complain about is, well, the dub. You look at, and I was reading a review of this game, you look at the Japanese Final Fantasy rankings, 10 is one of the best loved games in Japan. Here, it's one of the worst. Because the dub job on this game was kind of, well, Waka sounds like a cross between Bender and a Jamaican. Which makes perfect sense because it's Bender's voice actor. Tidus's voice is way too whiny, way too high-pitched. In Japanese, it's a little bit deeper. Yuna cannot deliver a serious inflection to save her. My name is Yuna Leska. Watch out! We need to stop that monster. She pretty much just is phoning it in. I swear to God, she just picked up a phone, was like reading like a light novel and saying, so that means we have to stop Sin no matter what happens. Oh, you mean I'm supposed to be crying during that? The in-battle voice clips, sometimes a little unnecessary. One thing I forgot to mention previously, one of my favorite things about this game is you can swap your party members out in combat. So you can level all your characters simultaneously. I like that. But people remember this game as having a horrible dub, and that dragged it down. I'm hoping that when the version comes out for the Vita, that they give you an opportunity to have subtitles with a Japanese voice track. Perhaps a lot of people that don't like this game will be able to go back and look and maybe find something new about it that they liked. So, I make the argument, this is just me, this is just a guy who's been playing Final Fantasy for way too damn long. God, how long? I've been playing Final Fantasy for 20 years. 20 years. Holy damn, I can't remember anything I've stuck with that long. This is the point where the game stopped really evolving. Now, all the evolution is to making it look pretty. All the evolution in the game now is brought out the whole idea that we can make the game look nice and people will automatically buy it. Final Fantasy is no longer a game, it is a brand name. People see Final Fantasy, they purchase it because it's Final Fantasy. Some people don't have a problem with this. Some people have a major problem with this, especially the crowd that's been with the game series since the beginning, that remembers the original style of narrative, that remembers how the games originally were deep storytelling with a lot of interaction, 1,000 job classes that required you to think and have fun, not proceed along a linear path to a predetermined goal with predetermined character voices where you're just kind of, you know, if I had a monkey just press up on the control pad, I could just sit back and not do anything. That was 12 and 13. 13 more so. I wanted to train a dog to just hold up and see what happens. But Square was trying to do something different. They were trying to create a form of quasi-interactive storytelling that had never been done before. Well, Parasite sort of. But quasi-storytelling that had never been done before. And they really gave it their all. Unfortunately, I sort of dubbed this a bit of a failure because while they did attain their goal of making a cinematic RPG, it ticked off way too many people. So, this is the end of the road. Or is it? Okay. Squaresoft presents Charlie's Angels. Otherwise known as Final Fantasy XII. You see, Final Fantasy XII has an interesting story behind it. Who here remembers Spirits Within? Who here remembers what Spirits Within did to Final Fantasy? It bankrupted Square. They put all this money into a movie that flopped worse than John Carter. Now the thing is, and I'm not disrespecting John Carter, that movie was awesome. But the point is, this is a video game company that sunk all their money into a movie that failed and then stopped being a video game company. The biggest insult is that they were eaten by their rivals, ENIX. Final Fantasy XII was their way of recouping a little bit of money. It was the first direct sequel to a Final Fantasy game, mostly because they had the backgrounds, all they needed to do was change the characters around. But let's have a bit more. Let's make this fan service fantasy. I have friends who play this game simply to watch the dress changing scene, where you see them in their bra and panties for 3 seconds, they turn into something else. You had a goth girl, an irksome little child, and you know. tidbit, and this is official Square canon. This is in a Square book. This is the prequel to Final Fantasy VII. Some kid named Shinra makes a rocket, flies into another planet, and his descendants populate that world. This is in one of the ultimate guides. This is a prequel to Final Fantasy VII. How many people now have knocked that game 3 steps down on the list? The modern version of the palette swap, Lena and Shu Yin are just Tidus and Yuna with slightly different clothing and slightly different face. One thing that this game does get quite kind of interesting, you can see this as a post-World War II Japan. The war is over. We got devastated. Let's rebuild. So, I didn't mind it. I actually really enjoyed it because the game was for me, it didn't make me think. I could just play Final Fantasy XII, XII, and 12, and I didn't have to think. I could just play through a game, thoroughly enjoy myself, put the game down, never play it again. I did slog through the 2.5-hour battle against Angra, mind you. That was fun. That is, to this day, the only special boss I've ever bothered to beat. But it was fun. Now we come to Final Fantasy XI. Or as my friends call it, Squaresoft assumes you have friends. Final Fantasy XI Online was, I think it still is, the most popular MMORPG in Japan. Because in Japan, everyone plays games online. What's the #1 MMORPG in America? World of Warcraft. Why? Because you can solo the entire game. You can be as antisocial as you want in that game, nobody cares. And then when you reach max level and you have nothing to do, you go to Goldshire and start looking for sex. Final Fantasy XI requires a party. Final Fantasy XI requires that you play smart, because if you die, you lose experience. It takes forever because certain points, you cannot get past a certain point without doing a massive world event. The problem is, very few people in America play this game. So you see people stuck on level 55 for 3 months. Running around, please, please, please help me get through to the next point of the game. But it does have an interesting story. Chains of Promathia is the greatest expansion to an MMO I have ever played. And I've played a lot of MMOs in my day. Beautiful music, beautiful voice acting, beautiful characterization. So, okay, we only have like 3 minutes. So, this is one of those games that's kind of interesting, just if you want to get a free trial and sample it and see what you think. You may get addicted, you may not. Now let's see if I can blast through the rest of this panel in a few minutes. Final Fantasy XII, otherwise known as Star Wars. Evil empire conquers your country, kills your husband, you go around fighting him. Luke, I am your father. Bash, I am your brother. Giant Judge, I am everybody's mom. And you go straight through the game. Main character, not really. Evil Sid, yes. License for it, Spirit Grid returns in tweaked form. Horrible lack of consistency. Why? Akitoshi Kawazu's back. Because the original developer had a nervous breakdown and quit. I secretly think that another game company stole them away. Final Fantasy XIII. Chocobos. Final Fantasy XIII, and the funny part is, and this is what I'm just going to say, Zaz is the most interesting character in that game. Take from that one you will. Streamlined, you don't have any world to explore, you simply press up on the controller. You also don't need to control your characters because of the paradigm system. If you've ever played World of Warcraft, your raid awareness is now going to help you. Really, really linear. The Crystarium is a beautiful, flashy sphere grid. I hate that it maxes out after a point. You get to fight against your inner demons, then never use them in battle. And yada, 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 pretty yada, yada, yada. I want to take, what's his name? Hope, and punch him in the face. Final Fantasy XIV, Square still assumes you have friends. It also doesn't listen to its beta testers. Because when the beta tester said this game sucks, nobody paid any attention to it. So I think that's the end. That is the end. So I haven't played it yet. I also haven't played 13.2. I hear 13.2 is a lot better. So I hope this has been a fun trip down memory lane. My next panel is at 5 o'clock, the honor of a greater power, politics, terrorism, and rebellion in Mobile Suit Gundam. Also in this room.